It's Thursday, September 10th. President Trump denies that he lied to the American people about the dangers of the coronavirus pandemic by downplaying it.
We're going to get through this, and we're right now, I hope, really think we're rounding the final turn. And a lot of good things are happening with vaccines and with therapeutics. But there's no lying. And the way you asked that question is very disgraceful.
Trump tries to shift blame to Bob Woodward, the reporter who wrote up what Trump really thought when he talked to him in private. The Senate votes down a so-called skinny Republican Coronavirus Economic Relief Act, which Democrats had denounced as anemic and totally inadequate.
Senator McConnell says he's prepared a so-called skinny COVID bill to put before the Senate. But he put it before us on a take it or leave it. No amendments, no debate. Well, this proposal isn't skinny, it's anemic. Senator
Wildfires in California breaking record 6 of the largest fires in state history since modern records keeping began currently are burning. More than 3 million acres have been scorched across the state, the most ever in one season. Less than 8 weeks before the November 3rd elections, President Trump's campaign urges a federal judge in Las Vegas to block a new state law and prevent mail-in ballots from going to all active Nevada voters. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court steps in to stop absentee ballots from being mailed out in that state. From Pacifica Radio, KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, this is the Evening News. I'm Mark Miracle. President Donald Trump launched a counterattack against Washington Post reporter Bob Woodward today, arguing that he would have released recordings of the president's remarks about the coronavirus sooner if they were truly politically damaging or revealed a threat to American safety. The offensive by the president comes as he continues to face intense condemnation in the hours after the Washington Post and other media outlets public excerpts of Trump's 18 on-the-record interviews with Woodward conducted for the journalist's forthcoming book. 2 tapes of the president, which have received particular scrutiny, were recorded in February and March, as the White House remained publicly dismissive of the coronavirus outbreak. In those conversations with Woodward earlier this year, however, Trump called the coronavirus deadly stuff and acknowledged he was eager to play down the disease. Faced with undeniable evidence that he purposely downplayed the severity of the pandemic, at a White House briefing today, Trump denied he had lied to the American people and came up with a novel defense that goes something like this. If what I said was so bad, then why didn't Bob Woodward go public with it at the time?
You knew it was airborne. You knew on February 7th, you told Bob Woodward how it transferred from person to person in the air, how deadly it was. Why did you not come to the podium and
Well, let me ask you this. If Bob Woodward thought that was bad, because this is stuff that everyone knew, there's a report that I have here someplace where China said it was airborne earlier than the statements I made. People knew it was airborne. This was nothing. This was no big. When I say it was airborne, everybody knew it was airborne. This was no big thing.
I know that in February.
Well, read the reports. China came out with a statement that it was an airborne disease. I heard it was an airborne disease. I assumed it early on. The fact is, there has to be a calmness. You don't want me jumping up and down, screaming, there's going to be great death, and really causing some very, very serious problems for the country. If Bob Woodward thought what I said was bad, then he should have immediately, right after I said it, gone out to the authorities so they can prepare and let them know.
House Speaker, San Francisco Democrat Nancy Pelosi blasted Trump today.
This is a tragedy beyond words. He hid the facts and refused to take the threat seriously, leaving the entire country exposed and unprepared. He didn't want to cause a panic. Why? because of the stock market. Nobody wants to cause a panic. You want to show leadership, show a strategic plan.
Los Angeles Congressman Ted Lieu called Trump's decision reckless homicide on social media, saying Trump repeatedly lied to the American people, and that resulted in preventable deaths. This is reckless homicide. Noting 6 million people in the U.S. have been infected with the virus, Silicon Valley Congressman Democrat Ro Khanna said, quote, "This is a betrayal of his highest duty to keep our nation safe." And Minnesota Democrat Ilhan Omar, whose father died of the coronavirus, said on social media, "All I can think about is my father and the nearly 200,000 other people who lost their lives to COVID-19 as a result of this president's gross negligence and lies. Trump had the power to save lives and went out of his way not to," unquote. Meanwhile, Trump resumed today an aggressive campaign schedule, despite growing resistance from local leaders who've expressed alarm at his insistence on holding large-scale rallies during a pandemic. While the rallies so far have been held in airport hangars open to the air, they have been drawing thousands of supporters despite local restrictions, and the majority of attendees have refused to wear masks even when mask mandates are in place. Today, Trump was in Michigan. Michigan Governor Whitmer did not try to scuttle the rally despite a cap on outdoor gatherings of 100, but warned that such events threaten all the sacrifice that residents in the state have made to get the coronavirus under control. Earlier this week, Trump held a rally in North Carolina that drew a mostly maskless crowd of thousands. While an executive order currently limits outdoor gatherings to 50 people and mandates masks in public in North Carolina, the rally was technically legal under the state's pandemic rules that exempt certain gatherings where people exercise free speech. Trump has characterized the rallies as peaceful protests, and White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany said attendees were exercising their First Amendment rights. This week, Nevada pulled the plug on rallies set for this weekend, citing that state's ban on gatherings of more than 50 people, drawing fury from Trump's campaign. Work on a new coronavirus relief legislation ground to a halt in the Senate today after Senate Republicans were unable to garner the 60 votes needed to move their legislation along. Republicans had proposed what they called a skinny bill, costing about $650 billion. Democrats have been pushing for a $2 trillion package, and they blasted the Republican measure as emaciated. Christopher Martinez reports.
Even before Republicans brought up their Senate coronavirus relief measure for a vote, the outcome was never really in doubt. Since no one expected the measure to pass, the Senate debate was really more about where to place the blame. That much was clear when Republican Senate Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky presented the bill for debate.
Senators who share the Democratic leader's toxic attitude, who think the real enemy are their political opponents, I assume will follow his lead and vote no. They can tell American families they care more about politics than helping them. But senators who want to move forward will vote yes. They'll vote to advance this process so we can shape it into a bipartisan product and make a law for the American people. That, Madam President, is what working families need. They need us to act. They need us to legislate. Today, they'll see exactly who has their backs.
Other Republican senators joined McConnell in blaming Democrats.
The Democrats don't want a bill at all.
Senator John Thune is a Republican from South Dakota. He says if Democrats really wanted a coronavirus relief bill, they would join Republicans in working for a compromise based on the Republican bill.
But for Democrats, delivering relief to Americans is not really of overwhelming importance. What is of overwhelming importance to Democrats is keeping coronavirus alive as a political issue. And if that means no bill, well, then Democrats are okay with that. They'd rather have no bill, zero funding, and a political weapon than have a bill and allow Republicans to say that we helped Americans.
Democrats have pushed back, blasting the Republican measure as too small. The Wall Street Journal has projected the measure would cost about $650 billion, including money for a $300 a week supplement to unemployment benefits compared to the $600 Democrats wanted. The Republican bill also included some funding for school reopenings, the Postal Service, and some money to fund vaccines and testing. Republicans called it a skinny bill. That's compared to much larger Democratic proposals that include funding for state and local governments, another round of $1,200 stimulus payments to individuals, and more money for testing and for schools and the post office. Democrat Mazie Hirono of Hawaii calls the Republican bill anemic and weak at best, saying it does more to help Republicans' corporate benefactors than it does to address the pain people are feeling right now.
While the majority leader struggles to unite his caucus even around an emaciated, weak bill like the one we voted on today, Democrats are united behind passing the HEROES Act because that bill's scope matches the urgency and severity of this moment. I certainly understand and appreciate the need to negotiate and compromise to get something done, but we cannot lose sight of who we are fighting for. Unlike the majority leader and Senate Republicans who are fighting tooth and nail for corporate interests in the next COVID bill, I'm fighting for the workers, families, and small businesses who are getting screwed.
Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer, like Hirono, describes the Republican bill as not skinny but emaciated. He pushed back against claims Democrats are delaying action. Instead, he painted a picture of Republicans fumbling on coronavirus aid over the spring and summer, and even for months after the House passed a $3 trillion relief bill and sent it to the Senate for action that never came.
Now, the Republican leader claims the vote this week will expose Democratic obstruction and delay. Another one of these Alice in Wonderland type statements. But of course, Democrats weren't the ones who said, let's put the Senate on pause. Who said that? Democrats didn't say, let's wait and see. Who said that? Democrats didn't delay for 4 months while the nation suffered. In fact, the House passed a bill with the broad support of Senate Democrats. And so while the president was lying to the American people about the coronavirus, Senate Republicans were following suit in spirit.
Schumer also took the opportunity to criticize Donald Trump's reported statements to journalist Bob Woodward, showing Trump knew but downplayed the COVID-19 threat. He showed no patience with Trump's justification that he did not want to cause a panic.
Really? Is this the same president who's busy panicking America right now? Telling women in the suburbs that your safety is at risk when the suburbs are not at risk at all? Is this the same president who invented a caravan of migrants in an attempt to panic Americans before the last election? This president always uses panic as a tool when he thinks it serves his interest. So the idea that he did it because he didn't want to panic Americans does not ring true. It seems like an ex post facto excuse for the president's perfidious lies. President Trump doesn't mind panicking people when it serves his interest.
In the final Senate floor vote, the Republican measure failed on a near party line vote of 52 to 47. Republican Rand Paul joined Democrats to deny the bill the 60 votes it needed to pass out of the Senate. In theory, Congress could still act on another coronavirus relief bill before it goes on recess for the elections. But that small window of opportunity seems to be rapidly closing. Reporting for Pacifica Radio News KPFA, I'm Christopher Martinez.
You're listening to the Evening News in KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online at kpfa.org. Meanwhile, the House of Representatives held a hearing today on sending more federal aid to states as governors across the country propose spending cuts, increased taxes and fees in response to increased costs and decreases in revenue due to the coronavirus pandemic. Though the House of Representatives passed a bill to send $1 trillion in aid to states and local governments, that bill The so-called HEROES bill has not been granted a vote in the Senate. KPFA's Kate Eder reports.
In June, Governor Gavin Newsom signed a state budget with $11 billion in spending cuts and deferrals that will take effect on October 15th unless Congress sends $14 billion in extra aid. Public schools, colleges, universities, and state workers' salaries will all be hit. California is not alone in proposing cuts to deal with the economic problems caused by the coronavirus pandemic. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz pleaded with lawmakers on the House Financial Services Committee to pass another stimulus package like the CARES Act.
I am here humbly and deeply grateful for the work that the CARES Act did. It did make a difference. 92% of our CARES Act money is allocated and obligated, and we have to look at an open-ended pandemic to deal with that. But please know, we care, and it made a difference. That's why we're here asking humbly that you continue this type of assistance that has made a difference, not in just in the safety and the health of my constituents and fellow Minnesotans, but it's helped businesses get back on their feet. And that's why we're asking in a bipartisan way from the National Governors Association, as you negotiate, please keep states in mind.
The bipartisan National Governors Association said that states and local governments need about $500 billion more in federal aid to avoid major damage to the economy due to the coronavirus pandemic. The National Conference of State Legislatures says that at least 3/4 of states project they'll have less revenue in 2021 than they anticipated. Many states and local governments hoped Congress would pass another round of aid after they received $150 billion from the CARES Act relief bill in the spring. The HEROES Act, which has passed in the House, would provide $1 trillion to states and local governments, but it has been halted in the Republican-controlled Senate. Republicans want a smaller relief bill. New York Democrat Carolyn Maloney says the Senate needs to pass funding for state and local governments.
Because of the pandemic, state governments are facing projected budget shortfalls of $500 billion next year, which is even worse than what was ever seen during the Great Recession. As New Yorkers, we have seen the devastating health and economic impacts of the corona crisis. I refuse to stand idly by and allow the Senate's inaction to exacerbate the pain the pandemic has already inflicted or jeopardize our road to economic recovery.
In New York, Democratic Governor Andrew Cuomo's administration estimates that the state will receive around $8 billion less in tax revenue than they had expected for this year. Cuomo wants Congress to send $30 billion to New York to help them fix holes in the budget. Facing decreases in revenue, some states, including California, are proposing spending cuts to the public education system. While questioning Governor Walz, California Democrat Katie Porter spoke about the lack of funding for schools.
Do you know how much the House set aside in the HEROES Act to deliver in K through 12 schools to have instruction, purchasing tech, teacher training, maintaining school personnel? $58 billion. And do you happen to know how much we allocated for the airlines? It just happens to be $58 billion. $17 billion of which went to defense contractors like Lockheed Martin, whose profits are at an all-time high. And the Senate won't even vote on the HEROES Act to give our kids that $58 billion.
Some states are proposing different solutions, including cuts to childhood vaccinations and job training programs. Others have proposed reducing government workers' pay and instituting new taxes on millionaires' cigarettes and marijuana. But because state tax revenue often lags behind economic trends, experts say that the worst is still yet to come for state budgets. The effects of the recession may continue to affect states across the country well into the 2021 and 2022 budget years. Reporting for KPFA Pacifica Radio, I'm Kate Eder.
The number of Americans applying for unemployment benefits was unchanged last week at 884,000, a sign that layoffs remain stuck at an historically high level 6 months after the pandemic flattened the economy. The latest figures coincide with other recent evidence that the job market's improvement may be weakening after solid gains through the spring and most of the summer. A rising number of laid-off workers say they regard their job loss as permanent. The federal government says the fund providing a $300 weekly unemployment benefit boost is running out. but all eligible unemployed workers will still get their share. The Federal Emergency Management Agency says the jobless boost will end up providing benefits for just 6 weeks. The program was created last month by an executive order from President Trump to replace a more generous $600 a week supplemental that had been authorized by Congress but expired. So far, $30 billion of the $44 billion reprogrammed money by President Trump set aside for the program has been sent to the states and U.S. territories. Many American workers will get a 6.2% increase in their take-home pay for the rest of the year, but the money will have to be paid back in 2021. Roz Brown reports.
A tax deferment began September 1st via executive order by President Donald Trump. It means workers don't have to pay their part of the tax that goes to fund Social Security. Trump has promised, if reelected, to make the tax cuts permanent, but hasn't explained how he would fund Social Security. Andy Landis worked at the agency for 12 years and believes caution is in order to preserve what has proven to be one of the nation's soundest financial systems.
I like to say that it's the one anti-poverty program that actually ends poverty. There's so many people that would be in poverty if Social Security was not there or if their Social Security was cut.
Under the executive order, the IRS will suspend collecting Social Security payroll tax from workers who earn less than $104,000 a year. Landis believes Social Security is strong, but says it's also at a turning point because baby boomers are retiring and collecting their funds. A similar suspension of taxes was enacted in 2010 to boost a stagnant economy due to the Great Recession. But the legislation required the money be funneled back to the Social Security Trust Fund. Landis wants to see a similar promise going forward.
There's no guarantee that it's going to be made whole by some other source like general fund. So that really worries me that you would simply cut Social Security's income when it's hungry for income because of demographics.
Landis adds the effectiveness of Social Security as a safety net cannot be overstated.
Look at the two words. It's social because we all participate in it, and it brings security because it's there even during downturns, during the Depression, during the 2008 downturn. It's always there.
Private employers do not have to participate in the tax deferment, but it's a requirement for federal employees, including enlisted military service members. For Public News Service, I'm Roz Brown.
At least 3 people are dead from a wildfire in Northern California. Wildfires in the state, as well as in Oregon and Washington states, have scorched nearly 5 million acres, the majority in California, bringing with it unhealthy air quality, displacing tens of thousands of people, destroying thousands of homes. KPFA's Christina Onestad reports.
Wildfires in California this year have broken records for 6 of the top 10 largest fires in state history since modern record keeping began, and fire season is far from over. More than 3 million acres have burned across the state, the most land ever scorched in one season. Daniel Berlant is a public information officer with CAL FIRE, the California Department of Forestry and Fire Prevention.
In 2020, we have well surpassed the record, burning over 3.1 million acres. Weather conditions, dry conditions, leading to explosive fires that have really just skyrocketed us past the 3 million mark, the first time in our recorded history. So 6 fires this year out of the top 20 have occurred here in 2020. Unfortunately, with several more months of fire season to go, this number could continue to increase.
The August complex is the largest fire in state history, burning nearly 500,000 acres, more than 471,000 in the Mendocino National Forest. The complex originated as 37 separate fires by thousands of lightning strikes. Many of those fires have since merged and are in parts of Glenn, Mendocino, Lake, Tehama, and Trinity counties. It has destroyed 26 structures and is 24% contained. CAL FIRE is focusing its attention to the northeast, where 3 people are dead from the North Complex. That fire has consumed nearly 250,000 acres, 247,000. In Butte, Plumas, and Yuba counties, and it's destroyed or damaged about 2,000 structures, including homes and other buildings. It is 23% contained and the 10th largest fire in state history. Authorities say more than 22,000 structures are still threatened, including the city of Oroville. Improved weather is allowing more aggressive firefighting, but they say heavy smoke is hampering use of aircraft. Smoke has plummeted air quality throughout much of California, especially in the San Francisco Bay Area. Aaron Richardson is a spokesperson for the Bay Area Air Quality Management District.
The air mass is mixed and all of the smoke is mixing down into ground level, where it was sort of held above ground level yesterday. So all that smoke up there has been coming down, and it's particularly been impacting San Francisco and the North Bay and then the near East Bay. And that, as the day's going on, it's sort of the extent of the bad air has spread a little bit throughout the rest of the Bay Area. When you get into the red unhealthy category, that means it's really not a good idea for anybody to be outside doing too much for very long, and better to stay inside with windows and doors closed to minimize exposure and smoke, kind of entering the house.
San Mateo County declared a health emergency due to poor air quality. The National Weather Service tells KPFA News smoke will likely linger in the coming days as wildfires in the northern part of the state and mild winds move the smoke south. In the Bay Area, the third largest fire in California history, the SCU complex in the East and South Bay is nearly 397,000 acres and is 96% contained. To the north, in the North Bay, the LNU fire is the fourth largest fire in state history. It's now 363,000 acres and 94% contained. It's destroyed more than 1,400 structures and injured 5 people. And the CZU fire in Santa Cruz and San Mateo counties is more than 86,000 acres and is 84% contained. It's destroyed 925 homes and hundreds of more structures. More than 2,000 people remain evacuated, and more than 7,600 structures are still threatened by the fire. California is not alone in an unprecedented fire season. Wildfires have impacted residents in Oregon and scorched more than 900,000 acres in a matter of days, nearly double the amount of land that usually burns in a typical year. At least 3 people have died and some 40,000 people have been evacuated. Oregon Governor Kate Brown says climate change is here.
We have never seen this amount of uncontained fire across our state. While our state reels from this horrific firestorm of dry weather, hot wind, and drought conditions, this will not be a one-time event. Unfortunately, it is the bellwether of the future. We are feeling the acute impacts of climate change. We are seeing its devastating impacts in Oregon, on the West Coast, and frankly, throughout the entire world.
Wildfires have burned more than 600,000 acres in Washington state, making this year the second largest wildfire season in Washington history so far this season. At least one person is dead, a 1-year-old child. The 2 parents are in critical condition. According to the National Interagency Fire Center, more than 100 fires have scorched nearly 4.5 million acres in the U.S. this year, sending 26,000 firefighters to battle blazes nationwide. The vast majority of those fires are occurring in the Pacific West Coast. I'm Christina Onnested, reporting for KPFA.
The Creek Fire in Sierra National Forest has burned nearly 176,000 acres of the San Joaquin River watershed since Friday. An atmospheric inversion that blanketed the lower elevations of the canyon slowed the growth of the blaze, but the fire is still burning out of control as evacuations of mountain residents continue. So far, almost 12,000 people have been forced to leave their homes. Vic Bedoyan reports from Fresno.
One of the fastest growing fires in the state has slowed its rapid growth, but the enormous amount of dry fuel continues to feed the flames. The creek fire has spread to 176,000 acres and expanding its footprint ever closer to mountain communities and rural dwellings. The 1,136 firefighters are laboring to build perimeter lines. So far, there is 0% containment. Brian Scott is the Public Information Officer for the Great Basin Type 1 Incident Management Team.
We are concentrating mostly on the kind of the south and west corridor, if you will. It's an area that we are focusing some dozer work and some hand line work in protecting the communities in that perimeter of the fire. And luckily, over the last day or so, the winds have not really moved the fire a lot. So that's good in that it gives our firefighters more time to build those lines.
There are 2 Type 1 incident management teams on site. That's how serious this fire is. While the Great Basin crew battles the western edge of the fire, a CAL FIRE Type 1 IMT is taking on the southern region. An atmospheric inversion helped slow the growth and intensity of the flames at the lower elevations, but higher up, above the blanket of smoke, winds and dry vegetation are keeping the fire active. The volatility of the fire and the dangerous terrain are presenting a major challenge to fire crews. And the strategy for how to approach it changes constantly. Scott explains that where it is safe to do so, firefighters can build fuel breaks and attack the fire directly. But that's not always possible.
If we can do it safely going direct, we will. If we can't, oftentimes we have to back away to an area of the terrain that's maybe more level, has different type of fuel types, maybe less of the hard and thick conifer forests, where we can actually safely build a very solid line. And then if the fire starts to get close to that line, then we can fire off of that existing line we've built, burning towards the oncoming fire.
Sierra Forest Supervisor Dean Gould rated the creek fire as more aggressive than any of the major wildfires that have swept through this region over the past few years. And Great Basin IMT spokesman Brian Scott relates that in his 20 years as a firefighter, he has never seen this much bug kill and such a massive amount of tinder. Those conditions, he says, have created a self-fueling inferno.
The creek fire, in the early days, sent up so much of a cloud of smoke, it built its own thunderstorm, and lightning came from it. That is kind of rare, but when you've got this much fuel building that thunderhead, that happens. And the thing is, any lightning storm anywhere around the state, especially where there's this type of bug kill, it's highly likely that lightning strike could start a fire.
According to Scott, fire-driven updrafts like that can be powerful enough to tear fully grown trees out of the ground and hurl them into the air. The creek fire has so far destroyed 361 structures and threatens over 14,000 others. The incident report states that winds are expected to ease over the creek fire as high pressure builds overhead, and a thick smoke layer continues to moderate fire activity on the west flank. Firefighters are taking advantage of these conditions, making good progress on developing containment lines and protecting structures. Vic Bedoyan reporting for the KPFA News and KFCF in Fresno.
And KPFA's sister station in Fresno, KFCF, is back on the air after the creek fire burned earlier this week through its transmitter site. Engineers were able to put KFCF back on the air at 2:57 this afternoon from its transmitter site at Meadow Lakes with power from a generator. You're listening to the Evening News on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online, kpfa.org. It's hour-long newscast airing each night at 6 with a half-hour edition on the weekends. And you can listen to the newscasts whenever you like. They're archived online at kpfa.org. I'm Mark Miracle. Residents of Northern California have been breathing in an unprecedented stretch of bad air. more than 3 weeks' worth of Spare the Air notices from the Bay Area Air Quality Board. Yesterday, the air looked as bad as it was to breathe. KPFA's Karen Argood reports.
Most Bay Area residents would agree that the Mars-like quality of the air caused by unprecedented fires made for a miserable day. Some calling the smoke and the poor air quality oppressive, apocalyptic, and hellish. But what caused the skies to have that orange-red color? Professor of Land, Air, and Water Resources Court Anastasio at the Air Quality Research Center at UC Davis says when you see a really orange sunrise or a sunset, it typically means the smoke has created a lot of particles in the atmosphere.
Forest fires emit a lot of particles, which are solid or liquid bits floating around in the atmosphere. They especially scatter the shortest wavelengths of light, which are the blues and the greens. And the reason for that is as you look at the sun, the shorter wavelengths have been scattered away from the path to your eye, and so what's left are these longer orange and red wavelengths. And the particle concentrations we've seen from these wildfires are stupendous. These are concentrations you never see under conditions in the U.S. in the absence of wildfires.
The smoky skies have gone as far north as Washington state. Pacific coast winds have pushed the smoke further out across the region, and as the winds scattered the smoke, particles began mixing with ground-level air, worsening air quality in much of California and parts of Oregon, where wildfires are also raging. Anastasio says the particles are toxic and the most dangerous part of air pollution.
So when you have a wildfire or residential wood burning, you make a lot of primary particles. Right? Those are the particles that are emitted directly from the fire. But these fires also emit a lot of gases, and we're interested in whether these gases can react within the particles to make more particles.
At the Air Quality Research Center, Anastasio says they are mainly studying the effects of secondary particles.
So under the right conditions, these can react to significantly increase the particle mass.
Wednesday air quality around much of the Bay Area was moderate, but Thursday air quality plummeted to unhealthy in San Francisco, South Toledo, and much of San Mateo and Sonoma counties, as well as Oakland and Richmond, meaning people should stay indoors and limit time outdoors. Medically vulnerable people should avoid the outdoors altogether. According to the 2020 Yale National Survey on Climate Change, 72% of Americans think global warming is happening and is harmful. Anastasio teaches a class on climate change at UC Davis.
Climate change really primes the system to burn. But of course, there are other factors too. Development at the wildland-urban interface. As homes move into forests, that's going to lead to more damage and more loss of life. The other thing that's been really important is the history of fire suppression in the West, where the strategy in the past has always been if a fire starts, you try to put it out as quickly as you can. And what that's meant is you have a lot of fuel now in the forests. And so when a fire starts, it burns hotter and faster than it would if you didn't have as much fuel, and making it much more difficult to control and making it more damaging. So there are a lot of factors involved. It's not just climate change, but climate change is pushing the system into hotter and drier conditions, and it's just going to make for more fire.
He says the current administration is filled with climate change denialisms.
They're reversing most of the Obama administration actions that were trying to combat climate change, including pulling out of the Paris Agreement. It's this anti-science message that's about climate change, but it's also about a whole range of scientific topics. And it's going to be making things worse.
Meanwhile, a respite from the bad air and a chance to see blue skies could come by the middle of next week when the forecast shows stronger winds and light rain. For Pacifica Radio KPFA, I'm Karen Argood.
Saying the president had exceeded his authority, a panel of 3 federal judges today blocked an order from President Trump that tried to exclude people in the country without authorization from being counted when congressional districts are redrawn. The federal judges in New York, in granting an injunction, said the presidential order issued in late July was unlawful. The judges prohibited Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, whose agency oversees the U.S. Census Bureau, from excluding people in the country illegally when handing in 2020 census figures used to calculate how many congressional seats each state gets. According to the judges, the presidential order violated laws governing the execution of the once-a-decade census and also the process for redrawing congressional districts, a process known as reapportionment, by requiring that two sets of numbers be presented, one with the total count and the other minus people living in the country without authorization. The judges said that those in the country illegally qualify as people to be counted in the states they reside. They declined to say whether Trump's order actually violated the Constitution. Opponents of the order said it was an effort to suppress the growing political power of Latinos in the United States and to discriminate against immigrant communities of color. They also said undocumented residents use the nation's roads, parks, and other public amenities and should be taken into account for any distribution of federal resources. The lawsuits challenging the presidential order in New York were brought by a coalition of cities, civil rights groups, and states led by New York. Because the lawsuits dealt with questions about apportionment, it was heard by a three-judge panel that allows the decision to be appealed directly to the U.S. Supreme Court. During a congressional hearing on conducting safe elections during the COVID-19 pandemic, Democrats drew attention to what they said was the real threat facing the voters this November: voter suppression and disenfranchisement. KPFA's Chris Lee reports.
CDC, Centers for Disease Control guidelines, were updated last month, encouraging states to implement alternatives to in-person voting in order to prevent community spread of COVID-19. These include expanding early voting periods, absentee ballots, and some novel strategies like drive-through balloting. All, however, require resources and time to train poll workers in order to implement. With November just a few months away, some states like Texas, one of 6 states refusing to expand vote by mail, are predicted to see long lines and understaffed polling places during the general election. An investigation by the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis found nearly half of all counties in Texas do not have enough poll workers to staff their polling locations in November. Mimi Marzani is the president of the Texas Civil Rights Project, who testified before Congress.
There has been a multi-month battle in Texas around voting by mail and who is eligible. Going into COVID, Texas was one of the very few states that required an excuse to vote absentee by mail. And then of that small subset, most other states expanded the eligibility requirements. Texas, as I said, fought us and other organizations in court.
Democrat-led efforts to force the state of Texas to expand mail-in voting were rejected by the United States Supreme Court back in June. Marzani says it's notable that President Donald Trump and his immediate family have all voted by mail in recent elections, yet Trump and other Republicans continue to try and persuade the public with false allegations that mail-in ballots or absentee ballots will compromise the integrity of the elections. Representative Mark Green, a Republican from Tennessee, says his state is offering $1,000 rewards to people who report voter fraud.
Voter fraud is real, and it can sway elections. This shouldn't be a partisan issue, but sadly, instead of strengthening election security, Democrats support initiatives like mail-in voting. Experience has shown that mail-in ballots have massive vulnerabilities and can be easily altered, stolen, or forged. If California wants to allow ballot harvesting and permit illegals to vote in their state elections, that's their business. But don't you dare try to tell Tennessee what we should do.
Some Republicans reject claims that mail-in voting will lead to voter fraud, like Benjamin Ginsburg, an election lawyer who has represented 4 different Republican presidential candidates. Across the aisle, Democratic Representative Bill Foster of Illinois argues that voter suppression is the real threat to election integrity, not voting by mail.
Voter suppression is a problem that is orders of magnitude larger than any concerns over potentially fraudulent voting, either by mail or in person. As many of you know, my father was a civil rights lawyer who wrote much of the enforcement language behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and it is great to see that the struggle for voter enfranchisement, which should be the battle of every generation, is being taken up today. But I'm also a scientist, and it is a scientific fact that it will always be safer to vote by mail from home than to vote in person. And the vast majority of Americans believe that that decision about where to vote should be a personal choice that should be available to all citizens.
Foster notes that every single state requested funding through the CARES Act to enhance vote by mail, deal with ballot printing, postage, provide services like drop boxes, and extra staffing. In May, House Democrats proposed $3.6 billion in additional election funding to support states in a coronavirus aid proposal, the HEROES Act. That provision in the bill and a measure to provide bailout funds for the Postal Service ahead of the November election has been rejected by the Republican Senate majority. I'm Chris Lee, reporting for KPFA.
And you're listening to the evening news on KPFA Berkeley, KPFK Los Angeles, KFCF Fresno, online, kpfa.org.
Hey everyone, this is Brian Edwards-Teekert.
And I'm Kat Brooks.
Weekday mornings we host Upfront.
2 hours of conversation about what's in the news and what should be.
Politics, technology.
Prisons, police.
What's happening in City Hall and at the State House.
In Washington and in the streets.
That's starting at 7 a.m. right after Democracy Now!
On Upfront.
The conservative-controlled Wisconsin Supreme Court today ordered a halt in the mailing of absentee ballots until it gives the go-ahead or makes any future ruling about who should be on the ballot in the critical battleground state. The order injects confusion into voting in Wisconsin a week before a state's deadline for absentee ballots to be mailed to those with requests on file, and less than 2 months before the November 3rd presidential election. Polls show a tight race in the state between President Trump and Democrat Joe Biden. Local election clerks sounded the alarm about what even a temporary delay in the process would mean. Dane County Clerk Scott McDonald called it potentially a huge disaster. He said in Madison alone there were 100,000 requests for absentee ballots on file, and election staff plan to work all weekend on mailing them out. If the court would order changes to the ballot, Dane County would have to print, package, sort, and deliver 500,000 new ballots, he said. The ruling came in a lawsuit by Green Party presidential candidate Howie Hawkins, who asked the state's highest court to take up his challenge of a Wisconsin Elections Commission decision keeping him off the ballot. The commission deadlocked in August on whether Hawkins had submitted the proper paperwork. Robert Kanye West, in a separate case, is also trying to get on the ballot after the Wisconsin Commission voted 5-1 that his nomination papers were submitted too late. Meanwhile, attorneys for President Donald Trump's re-election campaign are urging a federal judge in Las Vegas to block a state law and prevent mail-in ballots from going to all active Nevada voters less than 8 weeks before the November 3rd elections. The campaign argues in documents in a bid to keep its lawsuit alive that it is hurt by the state law passed in July by the Democrat-led legislature because it forces Republicans to divert resources to, quote, educating Nevada voters on those changes and encouraging them to still vote. The Trump campaign argues that sending ballots to nearly 1.7 million active voters in Nevada will impede Republicans' ability to elect candidates because the law will confuse their voters and create incentive to stay away from the polls. Mail-in ballots are due to be sent out in the next few weeks. The 16-page U.S. District Court filing was an answer to the Nevada Secretary of State's motion last month to throw out the lawsuit filed by the Trump campaign, the Republican National Committee, and state Republicans. Nevada argues that the Trump campaign and Republicans don't have legal standing to take the case to court and have failed to explain how they would be harmed. Microsoft said today that the same Russian military intelligence outfit that hacked the Democrats in 2016 has renewed vigorous U.S. election-related targeting, trying to breach computers at more than 200 organizations, including political campaigns and their consultants. The company said the intrusion attempts reflect a stepped-up effort to infiltrate the U.S. political establishment. Tom Burt, a Microsoft vice president, said in a blog post that the United Kingdom and European political groups were also probed. He said most of the hacking attempts by Russian, Chinese, and Iranian agents were halted by Microsoft security software and the targets notified. Although U.S. intelligence officials said last month that the Russians favor President Trump and the Chinese prefer his Democratic challenger, former Vice President Biden, Microsoft noted today that Chinese state-backed hackers have targeted high-profile individuals associated with the election, including people associated with the Biden campaign. China's hackers largely are said to gather intelligence for economic and political advantage, while Russia tends to weaponize stolen data to destabilize other governments. Microsoft did not assess which foreign adversary poses the greater threat to the integrity of the November presidential election. The consensus among cybersecurity experts is that Russian interference is the gravest. Senior Trump administrations have disputed that, though, without offering any evidence. More from reporter Giles Gibson.
Microsoft says it's detected attempts to hack individuals associated with both the Trump and Biden campaigns, with state parties, political consultants and think tanks also being targeted. The tech giant identified the Russian hackers as a group called Strontium, which U.S. authorities have previously blamed for an attack on Hillary Clinton and the Democrats during the 2016 election.
Giles Gibson, Washington.
The Trump administration today charged a Russian national in a sweeping plot to sow distrust in the American political process and impose sanctions against a Russian-linked Ukrainian lawmaker accused of interfering in the U.S. presidential election. In the case of the sanctions, officials denounced audio recordings that had been released by the Ukrainian parliamentarian and promoted by President Trump on Twitter. The criminal charges accused Artem Mikhailovich Lifshitz of serving as a translation manager in a Russian effort that since at least 2014 has tried to disrupt the political system in the U.S. and other countries and spread distrust about candidates. Members of the initiative known as Project Lakta traveled to the U.S. to collect intelligence and operated bogus social media accounts that could pump out messaging to millions of Americans on divisive social issues. The goal, to sow discord, incite civil unrest, and polarize Americans with social media posts that touch on hot-button topics including gun rights, immigration, the Confederate flag, and race relations. A prominent opposition activist who resisted her forcible expulsion from Belarus by ripping up her passport accused Belarusian authorities today of threatening to kill her amid their efforts to end a month of protest against the country's authoritarian president. Maria Kolesnikova said in a formal complaint released by her lawyer that agents of Belarus's State Security Committee put a bag on her head and drove her to the border with Ukraine before she fought her removal from Belarus and was jailed. Kolesnikova said they threatened to kill me. They stated that if I refuse to leave the territory of Belarus voluntarily, they will get me out of the country anyway, alive or in fragments. She demanded the nation's investigative committee probe the KGB officers on charges of abduction, illegal detention, and threats of killing. Neither agency commented on her statement. Kolesnikova, who remains jailed in the Belarusian capital of Minsk, is accused of undermining national security as part of a criminal probe against senior members of the Opposition Coordinating Council. She faces up to 5 years in prison if convicted. All of the council's senior members, except for Nobel Prize-winning writer Svetlana Alexievich, have been jailed or forcibly expelled from the country. Top European Union and British officials held an emergency meeting in London today over British Prime Minister Boris Johnson's plan to break part of the Brexit divorce agreement that was agreed to earlier this year. It's a move the EU says would demolish any goodwill to reach a trade agreement. Nina Maria Potts reports.
The UK says it's necessary as a contingency if no trade deal is reached with the EU. But Brussels says trust has been damaged as talks on that trade deal also continue in London. A Brexit transition period concludes at the end of this year, by which time both sides had said they wanted a trade agreement in place. Jessica Sargent of the Institute for Government says the UK is employing a deliberate tactic.
Certainly, if you read the text of the bill, the UK government clearly wants people to know that it is willing to break the law in these certain areas.
From Feature Story News in London, I'm Nina Maria Potts.
The German hospital treating Russian dissident Alexei Navalny said that his condition is improved, allowing doctors to take him out of an induced coma. German doctors say Navalny was poisoned by a powerful nerve agent, Russia denying those charges. Russian authorities have been prodding Germany to share the evidence that led to conclude without any doubt that Navalny was poisoned with a military nerve agent from the Novichok group, the same class of Soviet-era drugs that British authorities said was used on former Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury, England, in 2018. Russian doctors say they had found no trace of poison in Navalny's system when he was hospitalized in Siberia. Several people who have run afoul of Vladimir Putin have suffered a similar fate. Speaking at our news conference today, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov charged that Germany, the United States, and other Western allies who urge Russia to conduct a probe into Navalny's poisoning expect Russia to accept blame for something it hasn't done. Governor Gavin Newsom has signed a law giving tax breaks to businesses that hire more workers over the next 3 months. Newsom signed a law yesterday that offers small businesses a credit of $1,000 on their state tax bills for each new employee hired by December 1st. It only applies to businesses that have lost at least half of their revenue from April to June this year, compared to the same period of time last year. Businesses only get the credit if they hire employees, not contractors. Small businesses that are owned by large companies are not eligible. Cloudy tomorrow morning in the San Francisco Bay Area, but the Weather Service says it's expected to clear by the afternoon, producing sunny skies. Highs near 70 degrees around the bay. Further inland, partly cloudy all day with highs in the mid-80s. In the central San Joaquin Valley tomorrow, sunny skies and highs in the mid-90s. In Los Angeles, sunny with highs in the mid to upper 80s. That's it for the news tonight for this Thursday, September 10th. Thanks for joining us. I'm Mark Miracle. Good evening.
This is a community announcement for September 2020. The Sonoma County Bicycle Coalition calls for a Bike to Wherever Day on Thursday, September 24th. When you register, you can get a Love to Ride app, participate virtually in special events, and enter a drawing for prizes. To register, go to bikesonoma.org. That's bikesonoma.org. This community announcement is produced by the First Voice Apprenticeship Program. Please send your listing for consideration to KPFA at 1929 Martin Luther King Jr. Way, Berkeley 94704, or email calendar@kpfa.org. To hear this calendar again, call 510-848 6767 extension 621, or view it online at kpfa.org.
Apex